Welcome to HortTube. My name is Putnam. This is the October garden checklist video. We do one of these each month, just going over the things we do here in Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7B during different months of the year, how I'm thinking about the garden, planning for the garden, what might be going in the ground, what we might be fertilizing, not pruning, not pruning, all those kinds of things we'll go through in this video. October is a great month to plant, especially here in the South. Anything that's a hardy kind of woody shrubs, trees, perennials that are hardier than your area. And what I mean by that is I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7B. Our average low temperature during the winter is something like 10 degrees Fahrenheit. We rarely go into single digits. We will occasionally, but rarely. Our average is somewhere around 10. I don't want to plant things in the fall that would be susceptible to those temperatures damaging them that first winter. So if it's something that's only hardy in, let's say, zone 8 to 10, and we have a lot of things in this garden that I put on the screen frequently that say hardy in zone 8 to 10, those things were mostly spring planted, allowed to root in, get established, so they could put up a good fight going into that first winter. I think that's the most important thing, is you give them time. What I'm talking about planting in the fall is going to be, again, super hardy perennials, hardy shrubs, and trees, and things that have hardened off. I don't want to be planting things with a lot of new growth on them in October. We typically, sometime late October, get our first frost here in Raleigh. It's usually sometime around between the 20th and 30th of October. We can expect to get some sort of light frost. If I'm putting things in the ground that have 3 inches of new growth because they came out of a greenhouse, those are things that are much more likely to get stung. I want to be looking for plants that seem to be hardening off. They seem to be slowing down. The days are getting shorter. If they were grown outside, they've been at that garden center for some period of time in your area, they should be, again, not putting on tons of new growth right now. And go ahead and buy those things and get them in the ground as long as the ground's workable. This is a sky pencil holly called Red Sky. All the new growth on it is red. It should be available next year or the year after. Really going to be really kind of an exciting plant. Late season though, it doesn't have any of that growth on it, right? So it's hardening off, it's going to sleep, it's doing its natural cycle. Definitely time to put this plant in the ground. If you have lots of plants to plant, another reason fall is a great time to plant is that you typically have to do a little less watering than you would otherwise. You'll have to plant them, water them in well, but your water tends to go further in the fall. You know, it doesn't dry up as quick. It's not as much heat stress on them. You can typically get away with watering a few times, and then they're kind of okay. By the time they go through the winter and get themselves established a bit, you water them a few more times in the spring. A lot of times by summer, a lot of things can be mostly weaned off, depending on the kind of summer we're having in the first year, you know, as opposed to planting something mid to late spring, and you're kind of responsible for it for that whole first summer for sure, because it's just not going to be as established. Some of the fun things that you can purchase in the fall, there are definitely, we have lots of things in this garden going into October that are still in flower or are coming into flower. So things like in the South here, osmanthus, things like camellia sasanquas, which are just starting to bloom now. This one called crimson and clover has already been opening some flowers recently, but others are about to open. We have caryopteris blooming, abelia are still blooming. There are hardy mums that are available that, you know, come back reliably every year. Just make sure you're asking your garden center for a hardy mum, you know, one that will really come back every year. There are things like fall blooming asters, anemones, lots of things that are available out there that could have foliage color, flower color, winter interest. They tend to stock up on conifers more in the fall, and some of those blue conifers and you know, different shades of conifers, different shapes, ground covers, upright, narrow things can really add a lot of interest to your gardens in the fall, and then those conifers, you know, right into winter. Another fun thing this time of year is bulbs. You know, there are bulbs available at most garden centers, box stores, and they're available to order online. I put up a video the other day with our color blends bulb order for this fall. We have lots of bulbs coming for lots of different kinds of projects, and there are bulbs for all areas of the country. If you live in the deep South, Color Blends has a little tab on the website for southern bulbs, you know, bulbs that do better in the South. Most everything, if you're in colder areas, if you're in zone 5, 6, and 7A, you know, even up into zone 4, most of those bulbs are available to you guys and perform extremely well. But this is the time of year you get them. This is the time of year you're putting them in the ground. check, in your area to see what time they go in the ground. And for us in the south, some of the bulbs need cold treatment that they don't naturally get in the soil. So if you're buying tulips, you probably want to cold treat them if you're in the south. If you're buying hyacinths, you probably want to cold treat them in the south. I have a whole playlist on the channel about bulbs if you want to refer to that. You enjoying the cooler weather? You're still panting some though. All right. Normally in September, early October, we're putting all of our cool season vegetables out here in the vegetable garden. What we've actually planted out here are all of the container plants, and you'll learn why later. We've put a lot of the things that have been in containers out here for a while are planted all together in the vegetable garden. They'll be used for various projects next year, rearranged in containers, that kind of thing. The cool season vegetables, I'm just actually going to cut these off in this tray and eat them. We got several trays of them, or put them in slightly larger containers. But this is the time of year, especially in the south, we can still put in some of these cool season vegetables. If you're in more northern areas and you've got some ability to keep them warmer beyond a hard freeze, you can still be thinking about planting them as well. But there's quite a few cool season veggies. You'd be buying plants at this point and probably not doing seed unless you were really in the deep south, Gulf Coast or something like that. You could probably still have time to start seed, but plants are available at garden centers. And then there's ornamental cabbages and kales and all of those kinds of decorative things as well. But lots of edibles can go in the ground here in the south for the next few weeks and give you really easy, honestly, in a pretty highly amended, compost soil over here. We could put the salad greens in there and pick them for the next 60 days probably, pretty easily. There might be one hard freeze in there that we'd put a cover over the top of them. Other than that, just leave them alone and they just produce and produce. Pretty easy. A few other things you'd find at a garden center right now, especially here in the south, would be pansies, violas, dianthus, snapdragons. We've actually got some dianthus back here that have been in the ground for about 3 years now that just have perennialized, but they were originally purchased just as annual dianthus. One other thing we're thinking about right now, if you still have any of your summer vegetables in the garden, we've just pulled them out this week as you're watching this. So you're going to see this right at the end of September, before it flip the calendar to October. As we're filming this, like 2 days ago, the last of the summer vegetables came out of the garden. If any of that stuff's diseased, I probably wouldn't put it on the compost bin. Just find another place for it, unless you're definitely heating up your compost to kill any of those pathogens or any of that stuff that's on your, potentially was on your summer vegetable plants. And then harvesting herbs. And so we've got some sage here that still looks pretty good. So before we get a hard freeze, we could come out here and cut off some of this, basil, parsley, oregano. Rosemary's evergreen for us, so we can cut this right now and dry it if we wanted to keep it through the winter, or most likely we can just continue to take it out of the garden since it's evergreen anyway. But if you have sorrel or any of those kinds of things, any herbs that are out in the garden, go ahead and pick them and then look at videos on how to dry them and store them, that kind of thing. Because if you don't get them out of the ground now, or if you don't take any and preserve any, then you're gonna be buying them from somewhere else. And it's nice that you have them from your own garden from this past summer. So as we're looking at the garden here at the end of September and thinking about a frost that's coming, freezes that are coming, we're looking around and seeing how that's going to impact the things that are in the garden. If there are any marginal things out here, we're kind of going through and going, hey, we may need to throw a cover over that at some point. So those things can be written down, because if it's going to go to a quick freeze, sometimes we're running around scrambling. We've got a good amount of frost protection things, including pillowcases and sheets and towels and all kinds of old linens, and literally we will use anything to cover on a night where it drops pretty quickly. But with all of those things available, we still come up way short on what we want to cover. And so we're out here frequently, a lot of times back at that December 23rd freeze, going around going, should that be covered or should that be covered? Should that be covered or should that be covered? And you're limited on the amount of covers that we had. And so we're thinking about that now, okay? Something like this Lamandra that's a zone 8, grass-like plant in this container is definitely going to be vulnerable. This is something that we'll probably end up putting up on the porch through the winter time. We've got house plants on the porch that are going to need to come in. So obviously those are going to need to come in before any frost or freeze is happening out here. We're going through and making sure any of our plants in containers are at least a zone hardy or 2 zones hardier than our area, so that they have a chance to survive in a container like this. If they're in a container and they're marginally hardy in your area, they're way more vulnerable raised up in a container than they would be in the ground. So just going through, just looking around. This palm needs to be covered. This one, not so much. It's much more cold hardy. This Fatsia probably needs to be covered. Maybe not that thing. And just giving it some thought now, so that when something else like that December 23rd freeze happens again, and it happens really quickly, and you don't really have any time to think about it, we'll know what we're going to cover. We'll know what covers we have available, and we'll be prepared for it. I'm calling this the Big Four. The Big Four are going to be fertilizing, pruning, mulching, and watering. Okay, those are the 4 things we're kind of in charge of in maintenance in our gardens. And every month we got to kind of figure out which of these is, the important ones to do. I don't do any fertilizing in October unless I was correcting a single nutrient deficiency. Like, let's say you had a soil test done and you were way low in phosphorus and you wanted to add some phosphorus to your garden. October's a great month to do it, because the freeze-thaw effect of the winter will actually help incorporate it down into the ground. For the vast majority of folks, though, I would say there's no fertilizing to be done in the month of October, except for, I just showed you we would be planting cool season vegetables this time of year. Maybe we're planting pansies or violas or some of those seasonal color things. Those things would get some fertilizer from me. Everything else, nothing else is getting fertilized. I need things to go to sleep naturally on their own. So the only exception to that, again, would be if I needed to correct some single nutrient. So that's the fertilizer part, right? Pruning, I'm not going to be doing a lot of pruning this time of year. The things that I would be thinking about doing in that realm would be dividing perennials. So once we get a light frost on our hostas where we can still see them, that's the time of year, great time of year to pop them out of the ground and divide them. Same thing with daylilies, same things with a lot of our hardy perennials. If you know it's a hardy perennial, I don't do grasses at that time, or grass-like plants. I'll typically do those on the other side of winter. But most of my flowering perennials or foliage perennials, as they're fading in the fall, I'll pop them out of the ground, divide them, give them to a neighbor. A lot of times it's good just to divide them, just to give some relief to the individual plants. The plants get so thick they start to choke themselves out. And sometimes it's good just to start over with a smaller clump, in that same spot. Take the opportunity maybe to add a little bit of compost or something. But general pruning I'm not doing in October, because sometimes cutting on things can cause them to grow a bit, and that's something we don't want to do. Most of our pruning is going to be at the end of winter, and we have to be careful with what we're pruning regardless, because a lot of the things that are in this garden are very early spring flowering, and they already have their flower buds for spring, so I wouldn't want to be pruning those things. Lots of pruning videos, again, on the channel that you can reference, but 90% of my pruning is done in 2 windows every year. One right at the end of winter on things that bloom late summer into fall, and then the right after the things that are early spring flowering, I would be pruning on those. So that's my 2 little windows where I do 90% of the pruning, and then the other pruning we'll do is 1 limb here and 1 limb there kind of thing. So there's the pruning part of my Big Four. Mulching, mulch any time of year that the ground is bare. If you have bare ground going into winter, mulch helps regulate soil temperature, water, soil nutrients. All the things I'm talking about right now are, kind of regulated with keeping the ground covered with organic material. So if you have very thin mulch, or you can see the ground, there are fall weeds that germinate, that go crazy, henbit, chickweed, all those kinds of things go crazy on the other side of winter. So get the ground covered if it's not. And I would say that to any month out of the year. Mulching is a good idea. That's the 3rd thing. The 4th thing is water. It tends to be a little dry this time of year for us, although we got a tropical storm that gave us 5.5 inches of rain yesterday. So we won't be watering for a while. The watering does go further, though, this time of year. So if you're having to do any watering, it typically will last you a little bit longer. The days are shorter. The plants aren't using the water as fast. But do keep an eye on it. This is typically a very dry time of year for us here. I just showed you the dahlia over there. We're in zone 7B, and we're right on the edge of where dahlias are actually perennial. depending on the winter. I leave them in the ground. Most of them come back for us. Again, although we're right on the edge of that. If you're in colder zones, there are things like calla lilies and canna lilies and elephant ears and dahlias, and I'm missing some other things. If you put any of those marginal things in the ground or in your containers, you can lift them and store them during the winter time. There's plenty of videos on YouTube for that kind of thing. In terms of cutting perennials back, we let the cold take our perennials down to the ground, and then any of the rigidly upright standing perennials, things like Joe Pye weed, we actually leave through the winter because there are native bees that will use those hollow stems on those and overwinter inside them. And so, you know, if it's any of those native perennials that are standing up big and tall, even though they might be somewhat unsightly through the winter, they are a good hiding place for some of our native creatures through the winter. A couple of things I get questions on this time of year. Conifers tend to shed this time of year. So if you have any needled plants and they got a little interior browning on them, that's not abnormal. There are pine trees out here right now. I can see pine straw is going to be falling on them for a few weeks, just in the interior of the plant. They tend to do a little bit of shedding this time of year. Another question I get is what to do with my vegetable garden during the winter time. If you're not planting cool season veggies right now, typically what we would do right now, we would pull our warm season vegetables out, we'd put a light layer of compost in, those cool season vegetables would get planted. We didn't end up planting the cool season vegetables. We ended up planting all those plants over there, and then I'm going to go around that with some bark mulch for the winter time. I'm storing things over there, so that's the reason why that's going to happen. But do get the ground covered with something. Get it covered with compost, get it covered with wood chips, get it covered with something that will prevent it from just being overtaken by weeds during the winter, and it will keep that soil life alive during the winter time. We want to make sure that that soil temperature stays regulated during the winter like any place else out in our gardens, and we're not ever letting the weeds take over, because our seed bank, you know, if we let weeds take that space over during the winter time and into the early spring before we plant, that's just going to be more weed seeds dumping in our vegetable garden that we're going to have to deal with in the future. So it's best just to try to get the ground covered, keep all that soil life alive, and keep the weed seeds down to a minimum. Just a few other quick things here. House plants, I mentioned earlier about getting them inside. It's also a good time of year to do the pot switcheroo thing before you bring them inside. Kind of taking them out of the container and putting them into another container, putting some fresh soil on them. It's a good idea also just because so you also see that you're not taking spiders and all the other things that might be living in those containers if they've been outside during the summer. So that pot switcheroo has a couple purposes. I mentioned if you have disease issues on your summer vegetable garden to kind of think about disposing of those off your property in some way or another so you're not recycling them back through. The other thing is if you have leaf spot issues on some of your plants like big leaf hydrangeas and that kind of thing, after the leaves fall off of them, you might want to rake those away and hopefully lessen a little bit the following year, just the disease just bouncing right back up on the new foliage as they leaf out in the spring. We take lots of notes here. So we're looking at how the garden performed. This was a year we put less maintenance into the garden than we had the 2 previous years before. Especially the lockdown year, we had plenty of time to really maintain it. And then, you know, the following year, we put a lot of maintenance into it, just trying to get everything established. This year, we took off, traveled a little more, and put a little less into it. And so we've really looked at, hey, what really held up this season? And we've put that into some video content recently, showing off plants that have really thrived during this summer on less maintenance. And so if you want to go back and look at some of those, if you live, you know, here in Zone 7, or a lot of those things are hardy everywhere, you can go back and look at those videos because they may be helpful to you. So we're taking notes. The vegetable garden more than probably anything, because we had a couple tomatoes this year that weren't the best. There was one called Black Strawberry we had that was a beautiful tomato, absolutely stunningly beautiful tomato. Tasted like nothing. I mean, truly tasted like nothing. Most decorative tomato I've ever had though. So, you know, there's 1 point in that box, if that means anything to a tomato. And then we're visiting gardens. Went to the Ralston this week and looked around, went to Duke Gardens last week and looked around, which is in Durham, North Carolina. There's gardens near you that probably have interesting things that have survived a very tough summer that we've all just come through. Especially going to gardens where there's limited maintenance. So the J.C. Ralston Arboretum here in Raleigh is a great example of that. There is maintenance there, there's some watering going on, but for the most part, things are getting less manicured love than they would get at some of the other public gardens. And so I like to go over there and go, well, that thing's really holding up in tough conditions. So if you have that opportunity, or you have neighbors with things that have nice things as well, be observant, and that way you can do some planning for next season if you're not doing any projects here in the fall. Thank you guys for following along with the channel. I'll be back in November with a November garden checklist. Thanks for watching.